Hello and welcome to the Ori Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Jason Foster. This week, we're lucky to have Omkar Kawalekar join us. Omkar is the manufacturing and supply chain lead for NextGenTherapies at Deloitte. Welcome, Omkar.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm excited to be here and have this discussion with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. I know you guys are at the cutting edge of some of the trends in CGT, particularly around manufacturing and digital, and one of the oldest, I think, consultancy groups that have been focused in advanced therapies. So, I'd love to maybe start there, a little bit about both your personal history and also kind of Deloitte's work in this space generally, the kind of things that you guys get involved in. That'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, happy to share. And I don't believe it. About less than a month ago, I actually completed 8 years at Deloitte in the NextGenTherapies practice. So I actually started my career in cell and gene therapies back in about 2010, where I joined Carl June's lab at UPenn, and we were doing some of the preclinical investigation of how these CAR-Ts really work. And some of the work that Carl and the team was doing, as you know, actually eventually became CTL019 and then became Kymriah, which is the first approved CAR-T product in the world, right? And so when I loved the science of what it is that we were doing, but I was fortunate enough to actually build a home at Deloitte, because when I graduated from cell and gene therapy, from my PhD in CGT back in 2015, if you think about it, there was just a handful of career options there, right? You could either go into teaching or medical writing or research. But just to really understand the business operations behind cell and gene therapies, which is very unique, and is what we identified very early on. So when I joined Deloitte, our life sciences leadership recognized that the decades-old ways of working of traditional pharma is just not going to cut it. And so we carved out an entire dedicated practice called as the NextGenTherapies practice, with the sole mission of bringing these advanced curative therapies and curative medicine to patients in need. So that is our motto, our raison d'etre, our reason for existence. And so we started that in 2017. And as you mentioned, it was the first of its kind across premier consulting firms out there. And the one other thing that we did kind of differently and uniquely is that instead of having your typical MBA graduates, we actually got a very eclectic group of PhDs, MDs, nurse practitioners, value chain, supply chain experts, technology folks to actually come together and think of this entire cell and gene therapy ecosystem as a value chain that really requires a different ways of thinking, of working, and I'm sure we'll get into the discussions in a little bit. So that's sort of how I became part and sort of started the NextGenTherapies practice at Deloitte.
So Omkar, you mentioned, there's obviously unique considerations around advanced therapies that really the pharmaceutical industry hasn't really had to tackle before now. Certainly with autologous therapies, we have a circular supply chain, which is unique. We also have living medicines that, cellular-based medicines that have their own set of specific criteria. Why is it, we have a lot of people obviously that are very familiar with CGT that listen to the podcast, but, maybe at the kind of most basic level, what are the two or three things that make, from your perspective, cell and gene so unique compared to traditional like small molecule or large molecule supply chains?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something we've all been tackling, right, as being part of the cell and gene therapy industry, which is what really makes this different. So the first things first that you mentioned, we're actually dealing with live biological material over here, right? It's not your chemicals, your small molecules that you're mixing and concocting a product out of it, right? So the ways of how you handle these live products in a manner in which they stay alive, they stay potent, they don't get contaminated, that whole operational process is very different. So that's one, right? Two, you really require a whole different type of a skill set and a mindset. So the talent required to do this is still scarce. I mean, it's been 7 years since the approval of our first CAR-T product, but it's still not at a point where you have a plethora of like talent and skilled personnel out there. So you need to be very thoughtful and very skillful and when it comes to handling these problems. The third thing, which is kind of unique, is there isn't a standard way of doing things. I mean, as you would know, right? Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's logistics, each company that is trying to bring a product out of the market is trying to sort of build their own ways of doing, getting these products to the market. And so that brings in a whole other sense of complexities because you have 5 manufacturers and 20 sites, but the 20 sites who are trying to get those 5 manufacturers' products to the patient has to now deal with 5 different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
So these complexities in the ecosystem make it pretty unique, I would say, compared to traditional pharma.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're the expert, certainly not me. The way I kind of, in a layman's term, describe it is, GMP manufacturing traditionally is we demonstrate that we've got the same input, we put it through the same process, and we demonstrate that we've got the same output. That's my layman's understanding of how GMP works. Yeah, in our world, we've got a variable input that goes into what we hope is a standardized process that gets somewhere close to a standardized output. But when you're putting a variable input into a standard process, of course you get a variable output instead of a standard output. Yes. And this is the complexity, is that, you have to have a process that could be adaptive around whatever the, cells throw at us, whatever the biology throws at us during the process, which is why you need that expert staff, which is why you need those experienced people that are in short supply, and we can't find enough of them to do this kind of work. But it also, I think, when I talk about this issue, I often say we are already doing adaptive manufacturing, but we call it deviation management, right? So it's something happens unexpected in the process. We see something, goes out of spec, or it's headed out of spec, or we need to adapt. And we use very highly skilled people with experience to say, well, what do we do next? And we try ultimately to use that process to drive to the same endpoint, because that's what GMP requires of us, and that's what we want to try and do. But we're actually, in the current framework, we call it, it's a deviation. It's something we have to handle from a quality perspective. It's not, we don't think of it as adaptive manufacturing. But, ultimately, that's a little bit about what we're doing. I don't know if you agree with that or not. I know it's a little bit, maybe a controversial take, but.
No. You're absolutely right. In fact, we call it the happy path and the non-happy path, right? Right? And more often than not, you would plan as a manufacturer, as a player within the ecosystem, you would plan the happy path. Mm-hmm. But we have seen 60 to 80% of the time, the process is not following that happy path.
Yes.
Right. You're absolutely right. And the one thing I forgot to mention, and you rightfully pointed out, what makes this unique is the starting material for this is the patient. And so each individual is different. So obviously the material that you're working with at the beginning is different. So even if you put it through that one path that you have defined, you are going to find variabilities or variations. And and the whole point is about the success of this is about how do you actually manage those unhappy paths.
Yeah. And, I won't ask you to go on the record publicly whether you agree with this statement or not, but, I think the kind of traditional thinking around GMP needs to be adapted. It needs to come, we need to think about it in the next generation, because ultimately we all agree we're trying to protect patients. We want safe and effective products to come out of our processes. Mm-hmm. But the old way of doing it in the traditional sense of GMP, it's really not fit for purpose for living cellular-based medicines. And so we need to find a new way to adapt GMP thinking to this new modality that drives to that same endpoint, that same safe and effective output. And where I think we get into a lot of trouble is that we try and cookie cutter apply the learnings from biologics or the traditional standards to this new field. And that causes a lot of friction in the system, in my view. And I don't know how close or far away that might be from your own perspective.
I have witnessed that. I have scars of of having seen that, having lived through that in the past 7 years. Because you're right, the traditional, as I said earlier, traditional pharma was not used to this new unique ways of thinking. Even your operating model, the way you're organized within the company, the way decisions are made, the way you would think about building partnerships. Like you can't look at your logistics partner as a vendor. They're actually your partner in the process.
Yes.
So that mindset change has to happen. And early on, I would say, yes, we are 7 years into this. Early on, that was absolutely the biggest challenge that we would always hear from our clients, from our partners in the industry. I think people are slowly and surely recognizing that difference, but it still is a challenge, especially in the big, large pharma world.
Omkar, if you would, it'd be great to just back up a bit and kind of educate me and the audience about kind of the whole vein to vein process. I would say with a focus on, one of the unique factors, as we talked about, is this kind of circular supply chain. Can we highlight sort of the major challenges at each step of the vein to vein process? I'm most familiar, obviously, with the manufacturing black box, what happens when it arrives to the manufacturing site. But there are bottlenecks and challenges at each step, and maybe just a quick overview of, the process from getting the cells from the patient and then how they end up being back with the patient would be useful.
Yeah, happy to do that. And so I look at the entire circular value chain, not supply chain, as a 6 or 7 step process, right? You start off with identifying your patient, going through patient selection, patient eligibility screening, etc. Which again is one of the first introductions of the inefficiencies in the way it works today, because I've heard some staggering numbers that only 1 out of every 7 patient that is actually chosen to receive a CAR T, I'm talking about specifically autologous CAR T, receive a CAR T therapy actually does go through the entire process.
Yeah.
Right.
Very,
and
very
so,
yeah.
And so 6 out of 7 patients who could benefit from this aren't able to even get the product.
Yes.
Right. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Second step is actually, once you have identified patient and it's gone through eligibility screening, you then start enrolling that patient and submitting and start scheduling the entire patient therapy, which means scheduling the apheresis, scheduling the logistics around getting the apheresis to the manufacturer, etc. So that's the second step, right? Collecting that patient and the order information.
Yeah.
Inefficiencies in that step is each manufacturer today has their own process, their own digital portal at the hospital site.
Yeah.
So think of the burden that the hospital site personnel has to go through, because if I am let's say I'm a personnel at hospital X and I am fortunate enough to treat patient on 3 different types of CAR T therapies from 3 different companies. Now I have 3 different ways and processes and workflows and portals to actually keep in mind what the login information is going to be, what the process is going to be, how to actually enroll the patient, etc. So, and think of all the burden that all these hospital staff members have to go through in addition to their day job.
Yes.
Right. So that's the second point. That's where the second inefficiency comes in. Third is, now you've got to think about, as a manufacturer, how are you going to be optimizing your capacity and starting to make sure that the manufacturing slots that you have available tie in really well to that specific order coming in.
Yeah.
Right. Many a times we have unutilized capacity.
Yes.
At these manufacturing sites, and we've seen that too many times. So this is a manufacturing slot that could have been given to a patient and could have benefited a patient, but for various reasons, it just went unutilized. Yeah. So that's the second
Can I just jump in there on 2 points?
Yes,
because I think they're really important to understand. So one is on the kind of logistics side. So you're kind of challenge 2, I think, before this one. Obviously, we have to freeze the cells because most often they're going somewhere far away from the hospital to get processed. And that has a couple impacts. One is a sort of clinical, the viability of the cells and the potential clinical efficacy of the cells might be better if we were using fresh cells. It didn't have to be frozen rather than frozen cells. So the kind of cryo storage chain logistics is incredibly complicated also. And then the other piece that you just highlighted, which I was blown away. We were talking with one of the manufacturers who has a commercial CAR T product, and they were telling us around scheduling. The point you just raised is that, if the process bleeds over into 2 weeks, so it go, 2 calendar weeks, because you have scheduling of staff, over the weekend, and when you do intake and when your slot And when you finish the last run, potentially if your process is 8 or 9 or 10 days, then you lose that whole week. You can't, it's not like it stops on a Wednesday and you start on, Wednesday morning and you start a new one on Wednesday afternoon. Because of the inefficiencies with the transport and the slotting and the delivery and the staffing, you basically use that whole week. So you might have a 10-day process or a 7-day process or whatever it is, but it actually takes 14 days of capacity because you can't efficiently utilize it, which blew my mind. I was just like, I was totally blank to that challenge.
I fully recognize, I've seen that actually happen, Jason, because if you think of it, going back to the happy path analogy, right? From the time that a patient is deemed eligible to receive the therapy to scheduling the patient, collecting the cells, cryopreservation, shipping it to manufacturing, 7 days of manufacturing, quality release. I mean, on paper, you would say 3 weeks, 4 weeks, right?
Should be, if everything works according to plan. Yeah, exactly.
It's 4 to 6 months at times.
Yeah.
So that's why to your question, which is a very relevant question, where are those inefficiencies? They are at every point along the end-to-end process. So we've been, as I said, like over the past 7 years, we've been able to see, and I wouldn't say address all of them, but address many of those inefficiencies, or at least identify many of those inefficiencies in the process.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. I want to continue to go through, but important to highlight this couple.
No worries. Yeah. So we were at step 4 now, which you talked about, which is, you've scheduled your apheresis, you have collected the patient material, cryopreserved, and you have already reserved a logistics company or a courier company to come and pick it up and ship it to your manufacturing site, right?
Yeah.
Now, I know I said this is as like a step 4, but within the step 4, there's
a dozen other steps.
Yeah, exactly. A dozen other steps, and therefore, by the nature of the process, various points of inefficiencies that are introduced.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Not to get into details and too much of that, but because we have 6 more steps to talk about, let's just say all of this has gone through in a very seamless manner. Our next big step, as you mentioned, is the manufacturing, which is a manufacturing black box, and we'll get into why there are variabilities and inefficiencies introduced into that, but that is something outside of the control of the patient, that is outside of the control of the physician themselves. But that is also the point where manufacturing companies, very much like Ori Biotech, that's where you can try to reduce those inefficiencies, make that process, make that little black box more seamless, more predictable, more consistent.
Yes. Is it fair? And the listeners of this podcast will be very familiar with that steps, step 4 and the black box within there. But, is it fair to characterize it in your mind as these processes are often highly manual, so driven by human intervention? They're relatively low throughput. So because they're manual, it's hard to get a lot of doses through that process. And relatively expensive, because of expensive reagents, the people, the huge buildings. I was reading some statistics around some of the commercial manufacturing facilities that are out there. They're massive. They're 150,000 square feet of GMP manufacturing space.
Yep.
And often they can only produce a couple thousand doses a year through that massive footprint. Often because these are human being driven processes. And so you invest whatever it is, $100 or $150 million building a massive facility. But the relative utilization and throughput of that facility is relatively low. Am I characterizing the situation fairly in your view?
Yes, absolutely, Jason. So there are 3 main issues with that, right? I'm sure there are more, but like in my mind, there are at least 3 very critical ones. One is we have high costs, as you mentioned, because of labor, because of massive facilities, operational costs of the facilities, etc. 2, scalability is compromised. So it's low throughput, which is why you have limited number of batches that you can actually spin out of these facilities. And 3, most importantly, quality is compromised, right? You have opportunities for human error in being introduced. If it's not a closed loop system, you can have contamination issues as well. And very often, it's not just about the inefficiency in that one batch, but if that batch doesn't go well, you have to remanufacture it.
Yes.
So the overall cost, the overall efficiencies are significantly reduced.
Do you have any sense of, I don't think there's a real number out there that's validated. So the whisper number, I saw an article a couple of years ago on Novartis's process. They said there was a roughly 10% failure rate. I think the whisper number was like 30%. I think even with some of the newer processes, you're seeing double digit, 10, 15, 20% failure rates. Is there any feeling of how many times, out of 100 batches that one fails, or we have to go back and remanufacture? We're not able to serve the patient the therapeutic.
Yeah. Actually, one of my clients who does have a product, a commercial product in the market, when they started off their process, they were up to 40-45% out of specs.
Yeah.
Right. So 40-45% of the time you're remanufacturing. That's like half the time you're remanufacturing.
It goes back to the GMP point we just made, right? Are we setting the goalposts in the right place for these things? But yeah.
Right. But through detailed analysis and like doing failure mode, effector analysis, they've actually successfully able to bring it down to like below 15%, which is a massive
it's a massive improvement.
If you think about it.
Still too high, but a great improvement.
It's still a lot. I agree. Right. 15% of the time, like you are potentially facing some issues or doing some out of spec. So yes, your numbers are right, and it's still a challenge today.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. So tell me about what happens after step 4, if we can just move through the circular chain there.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So now once you have done your manufacturing, now the next big step is the quality release. And the reason I'm separating the manufacturing and the quality release,
I know why,
is as you were
so painful. It's so painful. That's why
it is. It's painful. It's not standardized.
No.
That's actually where you start detecting major issues, right? Because you've gone through this like 2-week long process or even more, but you only know it at the testing step. So that process itself takes at a minimum 2 weeks.
Yeah.
At a minimum. So you have a product that is ready, but you can't release it because it's not gone through the quality step, right? Yeah. And there are so many of these steps, many of which are sometimes outsourced to a third-party testing laboratory. Some of them you'll do in-house. And so that also raises, concerns for inefficiencies. The next step, which is absolutely critical again, I feel like all of these are critical, but next step is the last mile delivery.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the number of issues we have observed when it comes to last mile delivery is just staggering. Right? The courier didn't come on time, or the courier picked up and dropped to the side, but the person wasn't available to receive the product.
Yeah.
Or the product was delayed because of a flight issue, right? Weather issues. And so those do contribute a lot to the inefficiencies in the entire value chain in the vein-to-vein process.
Okay, let me just dive a little bit deeper in on the kind of release process and the quality process, because as you said, it was kind of the happy path would be 2 weeks, but I think the happy path is probably the outlier versus the kind of reality to say, sterility testing, as I hear, it takes a week itself. And then you have oftentimes you have paper batch records. So you have, tons and tons of documents that people have to fish through, and it's 2 or 3 people that have to go through that to release a product. So maybe here, just, if you can just highlight the current state of what happens during that step. And then maybe we can talk in the future about, how, later on in the call about how digital and other aspects of that might help. Because my biggest fear is that companies like Ori have a, big impact on the throughput of the process. So the black box gets more efficient, lower cost, higher throughput, but then we still have the bottleneck at release, and products sit there and they stack up and we can't release them fast enough. So actually the vein to vein time shortens, but it doesn't shorten a lot. And that for me is a major fear as we think about kind of innovation in the field.
Yeah. Well said, Jason. So, and please chime in, because I'm sure you have a lot of experience and knowledge in this as well. The tests are what the tests are. If the mycoplasma test is supposed to take X number of days or weeks, it is what it is, right? That's the biology of it. You can't really do much around that. The question is, can you introduce some sort of inline process testing early on to bring in a little more confidence in the batch that you're producing?
Yeah.
That's one. 2, I think you touched upon this as well. Right now, the consolidation of all these results, these test results, still is a very manual process. It's a paper-based process, right? Yes, we have heard multiple times about companies trying to introduce EBRs, electronic batch records, right? But but it still needs a significant amount of human intervention.
Yes.
Right. So to your point, and this is where I would love for you to chime in as well, if technologies like Ori's is actually able to keep a digital record right from the beginning, right from day zero of manufacturing. Don't wait until day 8 of harvest, right? Right from that point, and continue to collect that data, continue to mine through that data. And if you're able to use all of that to compile that electronic batch record at the very end, wouldn't that save a lot of people time, pain, money?
Yeah. 100%. And I think we don't want to wait till day 8 to find out we're out of spec. We want to know on day 1 or 2 that we're headed in that direction, and maybe day 3 or 4, like we should be looking for contamination. We should be looking for things that, that indicate that potentially we've got a quality problem. But we shouldn't wait till the end. And that's where, as you said, inline sensing capability, computer vision, advanced sensing, that's where we need to go. I think right now the industry is pretty far behind in our ability to really monitor in process what's happening. And so that's the reason why we then find out at the end that, oh no, we're in a place we didn't want to be, and we're not on the happy path. So, but I feel like this isn't a massive priority. The industry isn't clamoring for everybody to go digital and to get off paper. I think people are quite happy with their paper-based processes, unfortunately. But I think this is where we need to kind of a call to arms here to say, like, this is a major problem, right? In the near term horizon.
We actually developed a set of right now, Gen AI and AI is like the buzzword, right? Yep. So if you were able to do advanced data analytics, people are doing that in other industries, even outside of CGT, right? In other pharma. And we actually did come up with a bunch of use cases actually where AI or Gen AI could potentially be leveraged and alleviate some of these concerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to your point, Jason, either that is not the priority in the minds of many of the manufacturers today, or to your point, they're content with the way things are right now. And unless and until, and I've done this at various different forums, including have written about it in blogs, I would really like to urge the industry to take some steps to actually invest some time and money and see like how, if at all, these use cases on Gen AI or using AI could be put into practice.
Yeah, 100% agree. And we can do that together, because I think as we say internally, paper is the enemy of scale. Ultimately, to treat tens of thousands of patients, we can't do it the way we're doing it today. We can't do the quality process the way we're doing it today. It's going to be the next big bottleneck that we have to address. Well, let you keep going, and then there's a bunch of other topics I want to cover. But let's talk about the steps, whatever it is, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now we get the product back to the patient.
Yeah. So I think we are talking about our step 7, which is last mile delivery, as I mentioned.
Yep.
Very, very critical. And then after that, you hand the product over to your HCP or your physician who infuses the product. Of course, there is the short-term monitoring, the immediate monitoring around, what potentially could happen with the patient, adverse events, CRS, etc., is what we have seen.
Yeah.
Most of that still very much sits, as I said, in the hands, in the realm of the hospital. But then the very next step, which is also important, is your long-term follow-up. Mm-hmm. Right? As you know, there is at least a 10 to 15 year mandate to follow up every patient who receives these kind of therapies, especially CAR-Ts.
Yes.
Right? But think of all the data that needs to be collected for this patient for 15 years. Like, can you house that data in a single place where it's easily accessible and you can do some analytics around it? No. B, you're also expected to track that patient 15 years. 15 years, people move, people change insurance companies, people, things change in their life, right? So that is a challenge right now. So that is, yes, it's a last step, but it is also a very inefficient step today.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my education in the industry, having only been in it for 5 years, the process by which the hospital, because obviously the courier doesn't hand it to the physician who's going to do the infusing, right? It comes into the hospital. They have to tell them it's going to arrive somewhere on Tuesday, but it's in this like 3 or 4 hour window. Then it has to be communicated to the clinical team. The clinical team has to let the patient know. There's often some preconditioning or some things they have to do with the patient to get them ready for the infusion. That all takes time, and that has to be coordinated. And when you have a process that could be 8 days, could be 12 days, could be 3 weeks, could be 6 weeks, like trying to get all those pieces coordinated so that you can get the product back into the patient, which is ultimately what we're all working towards, is even, it's almost equally complicated. Is that kind of final delivery, final infusion piece can be extremely complicated as well.
Absolutely, Jason. And I know I skipped over that part when I talked about last mile delivery, but yes, as a manufacturer, you can plan for the logistics around it, but at the hospital side, they have to also synchronize the bridging chemotherapy before the patient and get the patient ready to receive this. So we use this analogy of like an orchestra, right? You have these different instrument players, and you are playing. Every instrument player has to play at that beat, right? And if even one of the instruments goes off beat, the entire orchestra fails. Right. That becomes, from music, it becomes noise. And that, to your point, that orchestration, that coordination across all these different stakeholders, including the patient, is what's absolutely required for success of the entire vein-to-vein journey.
100%. And just to highlight the last point you made around the digital component, the data component, the complete black box of hospital records, they might be in an EMR, but they might be in a paper-based record. They could be strewn across lots of providers, lots of insurers. The ability to capture those data in a structured way could greatly benefit the learnings further up the supply chain, right? So when we were talking about earlier about adaptive manufacturing, and today we can only adapt to what we see. Maybe oxygen is low, or pH is high, or glucose is high, or whatever the things are. That's kind of the limited scope of what we have today, based on the knowledge that, Ori's done over 500 runs in our system. So we ping that data in real time against our database to say, is there anything that we need to know about what we're seeing now that we can learn from the data? And that's kind of that real time adaptive view. But actually, if we could get some of the patient data from the front end, how many prior treatments have they had? What age are they? What stage are they? And then how do they do? Ultimately, how do they respond to treatment in a longitudinal way? That could greatly impact the way that we adapt our manufacturing to achieve the outcome. Because ultimately, the only measuring stick we have in manufacturing is, was it released or not? Was it a good batch or a bad batch? It's a binary yes, no. And there's so much more to it. We don't have any idea whether it's clinically effective or not. And so joining up the data component and trying to get some of those pieces together, I think for the future is really important to do this at scale well.
Absolutely agree, Jason. Back in 2018, I actually had a poster and a presentation on this exact same topic at one of the conferences I think it was the CAR TCR conference in Boston, where it did garner a lot of interest. But the challenge with doing something like this is getting access to that data, right? And that data, as you said, it's sitting in various different places. Could be some could be structured, some could be unstructured. So getting access to the data, or even having a manufacturer grant you access to that data, that is a challenge. It's not rocket science to build those data analytical algorithms. What is the challenge is getting your hands on that data.
What do you build them on?
To your point, if we have 10,000 patients today that have been treated worldwide on CAR T, I'm not saying get data from all 10,000, but even if you had
a couple hundred, a full data set,
exactly,
at least start there.
A few hundred.
Yeah,
you could start doing some correlations and like start making some connections. Like, if we did apheresis on a Caucasian male, age 58, with this disease stage and these kind of pre-treatments, and this is the kind of cells that we got, and this is the quality and the quantity of cells that we got. What does that mean in terms of like predicting the manufacturing yield? Right? You could start making those correlations.
You could. Yeah. No, it's always funny when people talk about AI and, advanced analytical tools, which is kind of the bucket that I throw all of that into. It's wholly dependent on the quality of the data underpinning the model, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. It applies here just as it does everywhere else, and it's, it sounds sexy, but we need to make sure we have good quality structured data to be able to build these kinds of analytical tools on top of.
Exactly.
And I think we've strayed into the next topic where I wanted you to kind of comment, which is really around the next wave of innovation. We've highlighted the very complicated current state, but we know there's lots of innovators that are coming to market trying to solve various parts of these problems, of which, of course, Ori is one with our automated manufacturing platform. But I'm curious what in that supply chain and with all the challenges we've just described, what's the kind of near-term outlook? What do you see in the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years that's got you interested? It's going to kind of come and try and help some of those challenges. Help us overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah, good question. And we have been at Deloitte, because we try to stay with the industry, if not a little ahead of the industry as far as possible, because our partners do rely on us to actually give them futuristic, innovative ideas, right? So what I feel, a few trends that will shape the cell and gene therapy market within the next 2 years or so. So one is automation. We talked about it. And Ori is very well one of the front runners in trying to bring in miniaturizing and standardizing and automating manufacturing.
Yeah.
Right. I think that will help with the scalability, with the quality aspect, maybe even the cost aspect, right?
Yes.
For sure.
Yes.
That's one trend. I think second trend, there's a lot of push towards sort of going to version 2.0, version 3.0 of the cell and gene therapies, right? So which means you are going beyond just your gen first of your CAR T, but now you are optimizing the design of the CAR, or you are exploring allogeneic therapies, right? Or you are exploring NK therapies or TILs. We just had one approval not too long ago, the first TIL therapy. So expanding modalities to further improve and go beyond just the hematology CAR T indications, going to solid tumors, going to other disease indications.
Yeah.
I think that's the second trend I would expect. And the third thing, which is very important, is for obvious reasons, a lot of the benefits reaping from the cell and gene therapy research and the investments have been very much in the Western world, right? We have to now think about globalizing it. There is a huge untapped market on the Eastern Hemisphere, right? And there are a lot of companies in India, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia that have now started running trials, building in homegrown programs and assets to treat those patients. So there is that aspect of globalization, which I think will also be very evident in the coming 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of those as critically important next steps. And I think what I fear we haven't gotten overcome yet, let's just say, so there's the idea of automation and maybe the robots will come to save us. Like, this is we've learned through the manufacturing process in automobiles, which you would argue is actually much simpler than the biological medicines that we're trying to make. There was a process of the assembly line, and then there were people on the assembly line. Then we took a few people out, and we put some robots in to do certain things. And then we sort of iterated on that. And then, we had now Tesla, which has no people at all, and we just have robots. It's kind of like, but that was a journey. That was a journey that happened over, 10, 15, 20, maybe even longer years. And so, the way we've been thinking about this, and I'm curious about your perspective, is, we need to understand the operations, the manufacturing operation. This is an operations problem. We've got a set of unit operations that happen in sequence. They're strung together and usually conducted by human beings, and that has its own challenges, and we need to figure that out. But the way to address an operations problem is by looking at the constraints within the system, and you address the constraint. Common language would be bottlenecks. They got a bottleneck here and you got a bottleneck there, and when you fix this one, another one pops up over there. This is your sweet spot, and I'm curious about what the solutions that I see today coming forward are. That facility is full, we'll build another facility. Or that clean room's full, we'll put another clean room next door, and then another one next door, and another one next door. Versus actually within that clean room, if you fix the bottleneck there, you can start to improve throughput, improve reliability by addressing it in that kind of operational mindset. Thinking about the constraints in the system. This isn't that different than making cars. It's very different, but from a operations perspective, the principles are the same. And I don't know if you kind of feel that as well, and see what you see.
Yeah, no, I agree, Jason. That is very true and very well said, because so far our CAR T manufacturing processes were basically taking something that was developed in a lab, right, in a research lab, and trying to bring that over into a industrial setting,
Yes.
right? And so obviously there are going to be scalability issues. Obviously there are going to be things that at a lab scale you can overlook, but once you get into a GMP facility at an industrial level, you're going to uncover a lot of things, and that's exactly what's happened, right? It's not, to your point. I'm sure when the first few cars were developed, very much hands-on
Yeah.
manual processes, there were inefficiencies, there were errors, there were issues that were developed that came up in these engines and all. But it took time.
Mm-hmm.
It took time for them to start identifying which of those unit operations can be standardized, which ones can be improved piecemeal by piecemeal, and then sort of stitch that process together.
Yeah.
And which is why I'm a huge fan of the technology, like, the automated technology is just like very much like what Ori is doing, because you're trying to put those bookends, the manufacturing bookends, into one closed system, right? Let's bring it all together instead of trying to move from one bench. I did the thawing on bench one and move the cells. I'm going to do the activation and antiviral transduction on bench two, move the cells. I do the harvest in bench three. Like that is during, as you said, like if you treat those individual unit operations like separately, that's where inefficiencies are going to introduce. But whereas what you guys are doing, I think sort of combines all of it
Yeah.
in one unit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thinking anyway, is that when we talked to Novartis and a lot of others 5 or 6 years ago, when we were sort of beginning the development, we said, ask them, like, what is it that what is the kind of primary need? And they're like, you have to fix the bottleneck. And the bottleneck today is really around the longest part of the process. It's the activation, transduction, expansion that takes, at that point, maybe 7 days out of a 10-day process. Those have thankfully shortened and will continue to shorten as new technology comes to market, like Ori's. But they're like, this is the bottleneck today. This is where we're kind of trying to address the problem. And as we do that, other bottlenecks, of course, will occur. And we talked about the downstream QA and QC. The challenge that we identified then is that by trying to kind of fix everything, because there's this debate about modular versus end-to-end, and you have end-to-end solutions like, what Prodigy has been for a very long time. They've said, well, it's a complete technology. It does all the steps. But the problem is it's not flexible enough for scientific scale. It's kind of been very difficult for people to develop their processes because of the constraints of the technology, because you have to give things up. When you standardize and automate, it limits flexibility. And so it's this trade-off between flexibility and scalability, and how do you get scientists the tools they need to do that academic process that you just said. I joke it's like an academic process on steroids when it gets to GMP. It's like, trying to take that, but you need something that's flexible to do the discovery work, to give those scientists that are so highly skilled the tools they need. But you can't lose the ability to standardize and automate and scale. And you need to be able to operate at both ends of the spectrum, which up until today has been extremely difficult.
And that point about standardizing, right? Like, I'm not saying, I think it's unrealistic to expect that you can truly standardize manufacturing across all modalities or across all different CAR-T programs.
Yeah.
I think that might be a little too unrealistic.
Yes.
Right. But I think there are portions of the entire manufacturing process that can be standardized. Like very simply put, like apheresis, cell collection.
Yes.
Yes, if these sites are already, these apheresis sites, they're already FACT accredited. They know how they need to function. They have processes and protocols. They have controls in place. They're certified, right? And to a large extent, you can just tap into that standardized process and not introduce unnecessary variations that are truly not beneficial to you as a manufacturer.
Yes.
So similarly, manufacturing, I do believe there are opportunities where you can standardize 80-90% of the way. So you're reducing your unnecessary costs, and your variability is potentially introduced in a non-standardized process, and then of course customize the remaining 10%, right? Like,
Yeah.
this process may need 5 days of expansion. whereas my process needs 9 days of expansion. You could adjust those.
And the way we think about this, and I don't know if it's the right way to think about it or not, but it's flexibility within a framework. You have parameters that you have to set for the regulator to be happy and for to hit ISO and all these other things. But within that framework, you have the flexibility to run a longer process, to do static and active culture, to add things when you need to take samples when you need to. You have all that ability to customize within the framework. The software, the protocol, like all of those things.
Correct.
Because that's what's required, is we can't lose the flexibility. And I think that's your point, is sort of standardization brings us to a point and has benefits, but we can't take it to the point, at least not yet, where we lose the flexibility, because we know how painful it is to tech transfer and do, comparability studies from one process at preclinical to another process at clinical to another process at commercial. We've seen lots of people, really struggle with that. So this balance is really, it's been hard to strike up until now, this kind of flexibility and scalability balance. And one of the things that topic leads me to was another question I had for you, which is, there's a distributed manufacturing or multi-site manufacturing is a hot topic in the industry. A lot of people talk about it. I think the regulator, both the FDA and the UK, the MHRA, have taken an interest in it. To say, I think intuitively we see value here, but we're not exactly sure what it means and how it works. And there's two big questions in my mind that tend to often come up during this discussion. And one is, how do we ensure that we are delivering the same product and utilizing the same process in multiple places? We have trouble doing it within the same facility with two different teams and two different clean rooms today, because we've got human-led processes. But then we're saying, well, you could do this at 5, 10, 20 sites around the country. How would we maintain the standard that's required for GMP, and how would we ensure efficacy and safety? So that tends to be the biggest hurdle when discussing this challenge. Is that right from your perspective? Is that what you hear and what you guys are thinking?
Very much so, Jason. I had actually written a short blog about this not too long ago, and we referred to this as democratizing cell and gene therapy manufacturing. We've heard a lot of terms being thrown around bedside manufacturing or distributed manufacturing. And yes, again, it sounds, as you said, it sounds sexy. It sounds like it could solve a lot of issues in the vein-to-vein process, the inefficiencies in the vein-to-vein process that we discussed about. But it comes with a series of considerations that we need to be mindful of. I don't think we're too far off from it. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, this does become reality. I would say it could very much. But to your point, how are you maintaining controls over your quality and your processes across different sites?
Yeah,
that's a question. I think that needs to be answered.
Yeah.
Of course, there are regulatory questions that will come up, like how are the regulators even going to assess and approve, the human use of the products coming out of these bedside manufacturing modules. But I think the bigger question is, what is in it for the center, right? For the site actually doing it. Can you actually very clearly demonstrate cost savings, right? Can you clearly demonstrate that the sites themselves are ready, right? And ready not just in terms of the skills required, right? The people required, but also the other responsibilities, right? Who is in charge of maintaining inventory, capacity planning, sourcing of the AIF material. I think these are some things that the treatment center shouldn't be seeing as an additional burden. They are already burdened with a lot that's going on their end, right? With patient care. So that true benefit, I think, needs to be very clearly outlined, the value of doing so.
Yeah.
And unless we get to that point, it will be difficult for sites to want to take this on, I would say.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think the advent of technology that can be demonstrated to replicate exactly the process, and we can monitor it remotely potentially because it's digital, it's IoT. We've just done, it's public information that we're working with the team at MD Anderson, so Jason Bach's team at CTMC.
Yep.
We've taken their existing clinical stage process, translated it onto the Ori technology, That took about 5 weeks, so relatively quick translation time compared to most. We then did some feasibility work. Within 2 or 3 runs, we were comparable to the existing process and in some ways exceeding the process they were currently using. The interesting part was then we tech transferred to another site, a partner site outside of Philadelphia. And we did a split batch. So we sent donor cells to both places, split batch of media, cytokines, all the materials, and then ran 6 processes in parallel, 3 at each site, and then shipped all of the material back to MD Anderson for analysis. And effectively, we demonstrated not only could you tech transfer very quickly, so in weeks, not months. It usually takes 6 to 9 months to tech transfer. So we tech transferred from one site in Houston to a site in Philadelphia in weeks. We then ran the process, and then the output was we got substantially the same product. So it met their CQAs, it met their release criteria for their clinical grade process. And that, I think, is one of the first of its kind, being able to demonstrate that you could actually do that. But automation is critical to that piece, and also digital, because you can't have quality people running around all over the country trying to review and batch release products. You're going to have to figure out a way to potentially, you can imagine a hub and spoke model. You've got a quality team that sits central, and everything's digital. If it's a digital back record, I don't have to be on site necessarily. There are things that have to be done on site, but these are the type of models, and it's really a technology requirement to be able to. We need that technology to enable this kind of model. To do it manually today, it's just too hard. We're just almost. I can't see how we get there otherwise.
No, I agree. I mean, talking about like the extent of using the technology, right? Like, are we really going to get to a point of like walk away operations, walk away automation? And I don't think we're too far away from that. I think that's very, very possible.
Yes.
And to your point, if we can demonstrate, like, as you said, tech transfer. I mean, you said 6 to 9 months. I think that is very optimistic. Like, I've seen some of my partners do a year and a half tech transfer and still not do it very successfully. So if you can do it in a matter of weeks, that's a huge win.
Changes the game. Yeah, and changes the amount of time you have to think about your process, and So I think that the advent of technology will definitely help us get here. And you made another point that maybe it's good for clarification purposes. So when people say point of care manufacturing, most of us, I think, immediately jump to kind of bedside and point of care.
Exactly.
And that's a different animal than trying to think about I'm plugging a patient in their hospital room. Is a whole different beast than I'm manufacturing products in the basement in a GMP suite, or in a center of excellence down the road 5 miles. Like that for me is what multi-site or distributed manufacturing is today, and what it will be probably for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. But ambition to get to the bedside, fantastic. But I think if we can all just agree that that's what we mean, not plugging the patient in the machine in the bed, because I think that's a whole different set of challenges potentially.
It is absolutely. It absolutely is. In fact, and that blog that I was referring to, my first initial statement was like, hey, let's define what we mean by bedside manufacturing.
Let's all just get a common understanding. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And that's important because each one has its own models. And we do have a team, actually, one of my colleagues who's actually working on these different sort of models or variations of bedside manufacturing and the implications of each one of these.
Yeah.
Right. So absolutely right. Like, I think that clarity is required.
And I think we all, we want to move in that direction because of the potential clinical benefits, this time savings, the complexity, reduction, et cetera. And we'll get there. And it'll be sooner than, I think you said, 4 or 5 years. My hope is it will be there in the next 2 or 3 with the advent of technology.
I want to agree with that as well. Yes.
We'll see if we can get there together. So as we're winding up our time together, there's a couple other questions I had for you. One about other technologies that you see out there. We talked a little bit about analytics. I think inline analytics is one of the areas that there's a massive gap currently. Just the whole kind of analytical process around the process is challenging. What are other technologies, physical? It's interesting also in the industry. We talk about technologies in 2 ways. Some are kind of like if you had a knockout, gene editing technology. We talk about that as a technology. That's like a biological technology, but also kind of a physical technology. It might be digital. It might be hardware. It might be software. Like, are there other technologies that you see on the horizon or that are here, being developed that get you really excited as far as potentially addressing other parts of the bottleneck that we discussed?
Yeah, actually, so obviously, as I said, digital technology and automation, like Ori and the others,
Yeah.
very, very key. Digital orchestration solutions is also important because, as I said earlier, like in order to reduce the burden on these hospital personnel of having to like learn how to work on five different portals from five different
Yeah.
manufacturers, you can have a utility type of solution where you have one login for per person, and then you can choose which
Yeah.
therapy you want the patient to go through. I think that's another move towards lowering the burden and like using technologies. But in terms of biological technologies, I'm sure you've heard of Blue Whale Bio, which is a startup from Carl's lab.
Yes.
They're actually trying to develop biological platforms and a series of programs that can help improve manufacturing of these of cell therapies, right?
Yes.
And if you are able to have a more consistent manufacturing yield, a more predictable quality of cells, a more predictable ratio of like helper T cells versus cytotoxic T cells, um, that I feel that's something that's truly exciting for me personally because A, I'm a lab scientist, B, it's coming from my PI's lab as well. But I think that those are the kind of technologies that I'm very, very excited about because it is, again, a step towards ultimately broadening the access of and then the availability of these therapies to a wider pool of patients.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that's what you and I are doing our job for today, right? It's
Exactly.
it's all about making this more accessible and available.
Exactly right. And I think I talked to the CEO of Blue Whale, and they're doing some really interesting stuff there. Sometimes I think we get so focused on today's challenge, particularly at the kind of PD or R&D phase. We're so focused on getting that safety or efficacy signal where, we're rushing to get a clinical trial because our investors want us to get there and our board's pushing us. And we lose sight of the bigger objective, which is if the product never makes it to patients or never makes it to a lot of patients, then
Right.
everything falls over. All the hard work we've done hasn't
Yeah.
realized its potential. Not only, particularly and most importantly, its human and clinical potential, but also its financial potential. Investors are
Yeah.
investing in our businesses to try and get a return on their investment. That's the way the investment community works. And products that don't get coverage, don't get market access, that are last line therapy, that we can only make a few doses of, are destined to fail. And I wrote a post about this myself on LinkedIn around, you mentioned the most recently approved TIL therapy, and I'm really excited for patients. Melanoma patients, and melanoma's a very high incidence rate. 100,000 patients a year are diagnosed. 8,000 refractory patients die per year of melanoma alone. And this could be a great intervention, but it's only going to be for a few of them, probably. It's a very long process. I think in the article I read, it was 8 weeks vein to vein, which is probably the happy path versus the unhappy path. It's $515,000 a patient. And the tools to really do this at scale aren't available. They weren't available 3 or 4 or
Yeah.
5 years ago when Iovance was doing their clinical work and trying to solidify their process. So no doubt they're having to use the tools that are available to them. And my fear is that product will come to market, will treat very few patients amongst the population that could benefit from it, but
Yeah.
could benefit from it. And ultimately, will it be a success clinically, commercially, financially? It's a big question mark. And so I think we as an enabling technology community, we just haven't really supported the industry as we haven't advanced at the same pace that they have. The science has advanced very quickly and the supporting technologies
Absolutely.
haven't. And that's really the gap that I see right now in the market.
Absolutely. Very well said. And I like the term enabling technologies, right? I mean, if the science is at the center and the patient is the center where you have developed a CAR T therapies, and that's what the last, in all fairness to the CGT industry, the first 5 years or so, it was all about proving that CAR Ts can work,
That's
right?
right.
Getting into the
Proving the
market, it
science.
can treat.
Yeah. And we're doing
Exactly,
that.
right. And to your point, that was the pressure from the investors as well, like get this to the market, right? So now that we have established that, now it's all the periphery around the science, right? The enabling technologies to improve the way you manufacture, lower cost, get more patients approved, get it more globally available, like have it more globally available, get it approved outside of the US.
Yes.
So that's where you're absolutely right. Enabling technology players, ecosystem players are key now, and that now their role is even more important and even more recognized, I would say,
Mm.
than just the scientists
Yeah.
who are developing and proving CAR-T.
Yeah. I would argue exactly that, is that just getting good science and good clinical data is no longer good enough.
Yep, I
I think
agree.
I had Jim Faulkner on the podcast a while ago. Jim used to be CTO at Autolus and has been an investor with Appletree and others. And he said the kind of the worst failure, you're expecting that you're going to get failures in the clinic, products that don't work
Yeah,
or, have side effect
yeah,
profiles that aren't acceptable. That's just part of development. The worst case scenario is that you get a clinically effective product that doesn't make it to patients. It can't get covered. It can't get manufactured. It can't make the clinical impact that everybody wants. You already spent the $1 billion getting it to market. And, for me, I feel terrible for the folks at Bluebird. They have what, 3 or 4 incredibly innovative gene therapies that are tackling really, unmet needs in the industry. And, they charge what they have to charge to get, make the numbers work for them. But it's, 3 million a patient, or between 3 and 4 million a patient for each of their products. They get their third or fourth product approved and their stock price goes down by 40%, because the price and I think the market realizes, at least the stock market realizes, that it's going to be incredibly difficult to treat patients with a product with that profile. And so when we talk to R&D and PD scientists, we say, you need to focus on manufacturing now. Like, don't forget about manufacturing. We know you're focused on clinical efficacy and safety, but you have to think about manufacturing as well. And when you get to phase 3, it's too late. The perceived barriers of doing anything else are just too high.
Yep. In fact, another article that one of my colleagues, Amit Agarwal, who you know, and we authored was that manufacturing should get a seat at the CXO table.
Yes.
Very early on.
Yes.
Right. It's not just investors and the chair of the board and your clinical leads. It's actually manufacturing as well. Like they need to be influencing decisions that a company is making, because to your point, once you are stuck with a manufacturing process, once you establish a manufacturing process, you're stuck with it throughout. And if you have not already thought about how you're going to scale this, and you have, to your point, yes, I'm FDA approved, but if I can't get it in a cost efficient and a scalable manner to patients, what's the point?
Yeah, and really, I mean, someone commented on the post that I made on LinkedIn, like, it just means that development's not over. Like, if you have a product that their point was around the price, but even if you have a product that just can't physically get to patients in high enough quantity, like, development's not over. You got to start early, and I think that was an interesting view. We're coming to our end of our time together, but I wanted to kind of pick your brain on one last topic, if you don't mind, and also share with us, not only yours but Deloitte's perspective on the future. What does the next 5 years hold for cell and gene, and what kind of plans or developments does Deloitte have in its bag of tricks in the hopper, or the kinds of things that you're going to be focused on over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the next gen therapies practice is entirely dedicated and focused to cell and gene therapies, because we believe that is going to be mainstream, right? We're already seeing some of the commercialized products moving up to us, even being a second line treatment.
Second line therapy, yeah.
Right. So which means these could very well be mainstream, not too not too far off from actually us seeing that. So a few things that we've been doing actually. One is, you're obviously aware of the industry working group, right? And you're a member of that. But we have continued to expand that, right? We started the European chapter successfully, because now we know we got to reach that area, that region as well. Two, last year we actually released a digital orchestration platform. We talked about the challenges with all the hospital staff faces with all these 10 different portals from 10 different companies, right? So we actually released a utility type of a model for a digital orchestration platform. We're actually implementing that right now at a very promising cell and gene therapy clinical company. And the third thing that I personally am, so I'm from India, so I want to see these therapies actually reach that part of the world. And so I personally, along obviously with the practice, we are on a mission around globalization of cell and gene therapies. So We have already opened up dedicated centers of excellence in Shanghai, Tokyo, Singapore. Of course, we have in Brussels and London. But now we are also working on doing so in LATAM, Canada, and Australia. Right, because these are markets where there are patients who desperately need it, and we are very much devoting a lot of time, money, resources into developing centers of excellence in these regions as well.
Yeah, no, it's so important. I mean, I think as I think I asked the question of the team, like, how many patients have gotten treated with the first 6 or 7 approved products, and the number wasn't readily available, so we went out and we tried to calculate it, using publicly available information. Year over year from 22 to 23, the total number of patients treated with the 6 approved CAR T therapies was close to 9,000 patients. It was about a 30% increase year over year. So 9,000 patients represents about, let's say 10% of the patient population, but only in the US, really. These products aren't available in Europe for the most part, and they're not available at all in the developing world. So it's 0% in most of the world. And that's just an unacceptable outcome. I mean, I think, Ori's mission as a company is to enable widespread patient access. That means access for everyone, not only in the Western world, but everywhere in the world.
Right.
And that's a critical thing that we all have to work towards in order for this to be seen as a success, in my view.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to see that about what the mission that Ori is on.
Me too. And we've got a big year in 2024 where we're, bringing the technology out to the world and placing with, we have a big pharma partner who's using the technology. We have MD Anderson we talked about. We've got a couple of CDMO partners, and hopefully the whole industry will be able to get access to it by the end of 2024. So super exciting time for us, and just wanted to say thank you for your friendship and for your time in being with us this afternoon.
Yeah, anytime, Jason. It's always exciting to speak to you, and again, thank you for having me here. I think step by step, one conversation after another, we are going to be tackling the major issues in cell and gene therapy industry, and I hope, when we talk again 2 years from now, a lot of challenges and issues that we talked about today would have been resolved.